I wonder what could be in this box. It's golden, and gold usually means something's very important. Parables are important, so maybe it's an important parable in this gold box. Parables are also old, and this box does look like it could be kind of old. And parables are often gifts that we receive even before we're born, and it does look kind of like a gift box, right? And it's also got a lid. Parables often have a lid on them, like a door that's shut, that keeps you from going inside the parable or understanding what it really means until you're ready. Sometimes the door is still shut even when you are ready, and sometimes you just have to keep going back over and over again to a parable and wondering what it means, and eventually it opens for you. I think I can open the lid. Do you think I can open the lid? Okay, I'll open the lid. We'll see what's inside. It's another box. That happened on Christmas a lot in my family. People thought it was funny to wrap up boxes and boxes and boxes. Okay, well, it's kind of a box. It's a basket, but it's also got a lid on it. Are we ready to open the lid? Okay. Oh, can you see? Don't take it out. What's inside? Not marbles. Beads. They do look like beads, but they're actually pearls. So now I know what parable it is. Do you want me to tell you? Should I tell you the parable? Okay. Once upon a time, there was a man named Jesus, and he did such wonderful things, and he said such amazing things that people followed him around. And as these people followed him around, they heard him talking a lot about a kingdom. And it wasn't the kingdom that they lived in, and it wasn't a kingdom that any of them had ever been to, and it wasn't even a kingdom that any of them had ever heard of before. And so they had to ask him, what is this kingdom of heaven that you keep talking about? What is that like? Jesus liked to teach people things in stories, and he actually told a lot of different stories about what the kingdom of heaven was like. But this is one of them. He said, the kingdom of heaven is like when a person who buys and sells fine pearls, a merchant, goes to search for the great pearl. Sounds kind of mysterious, right? This is what the people who were listening to him heard when he said that, or what they imagined. They imagined a great merchant with a fancy house and fine furniture and bags of money and rubies and emeralds and pearls and diamonds. But he wanted something more. He wanted the great pearl. So every morning, he got up and he went out looking for a seller of jewels. And he would say, do you have the great pearl? And he would pick up the pearl that the seller had and he would look at it very carefully and closely. No matter how big or small it was or what color it was, he would look at it and then he would shake his head. No, this was not the great pearl. And he would put it back. And the next day he would go out again and he would pick up the pearl in a different seller's stock and he would look at it very carefully and closely and he'd shake his head, no, this is not the great pearl. But finally one day, he went out to another seller and he said, do you have any pearls? And the seller offered him a pearl, and he looked at it very carefully and closely, And this time he nodded his head. Yes, this one was the great pearl. And he went home, and he packed up all of his jewels and pearls, and he packed up all of his bags of money. He packed up all of his fine, fancy furniture. He even packed up the walls of his house. And he took them all back to the seller. And he exchanged it all for the great pearl. I wonder if you've ever heard that story before. I wonder what you think was the most important part of that story. I wonder how the merchant knew that one was the great pearl when all the others were not. So you're wondering why he would exchange everything he had for one pearl. I think that's the point of the story, yeah. I wonder whether he was happy after he exchanged everything he had for the one pearl. I wonder if the seller was happy with all the stuff. I wonder what could be so precious that you would exchange everything you had for it. Thank you for sharing in this wondering time. We will sing you to your classes.
Our reading today is from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 21, verses 28 through 46. What do you think? A man had 2 sons. He went to the first and said, "Son, go and work in the vineyard today." He answered, "I will not." But later he changed his mind and went. The father went to the second and said the same. And he answered, "I go, sir." But he did not go. Which of the 2 did the will of his father? They said, "The first." Jesus said to them, "Truly I tell you, the tax collectors and the prostitutes are going into the kingdom of God ahead of you. For John came to you in the way of righteousness, and you did not believe him, but the tax collectors and the prostitutes believed him. And even after you saw it, you did not change your minds and believe him." Listen to another parable. There was a landowner who planted a vineyard, put a fence around it, dug a wine press, and built a watchtower. Then he leased it and went to another country. When the harvest time had come, he sent his slaves to the tenants to collect his produce, but the tenants seized his slaves and beat one, killed another, and stoned another. Again, he sent other slaves, more than the first, and they treated them in the same way. Finally, he sent his son to them, saying, "They will respect my son." But when the tenants saw the son, they said to themselves, "This is the heir. Come, let us kill him and get his inheritance." So they seized him and threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. Now when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those tenants? The crowd gathered there said to him, "He will put those wretches away and lease the vineyard to other tenants who will give him the produce at the harvest time." Jesus said to them, "Have you never read in the scriptures? The stone that builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This was the Lord's doing, and is it amazing in our eyes? Therefore, I tell you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people that produces the fruit of the kingdom. The one who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces, and it will crush anyone on whom it falls." When the chief priests and the Pharisees heard his parables, they realized that he was speaking about them. They wanted to arrest him, but they feared the crowds because they regarded him as a prophet. I'd like to invite everyone to take a deep, soft belly breath with me. Well, Mainline, this is the third time that you've invited me to be with you, and I am so appreciative. You have been a very good friend to me at the beginning of my ministry. And before I begin the sermon proper, I want to thank Nuala, and I want to thank our cellist, whose name is escaping me, and Dawn Starr, and for the worship committee team that made this beautiful setting up front. This worship service just wouldn't have been the same without this teamwork that you as a church provided. So thank you. Today I'm here to talk to you about the kingdom of heaven, or the kingdom of God, however you want to think about it. So, throughout my time at seminary, I encountered this idea of the kingdom of God, which is referred to in the Gospel of Matthew, which we just read a part of, as the kingdom of heaven. And I'll tell you, when I was sitting in my Gospels, Jesus in the Gospels class in seminary, I really just felt like I had no idea what the heck Jesus was doing. And I was raised as a United Methodist. I studied the Bible as a kid, but I really had this sense of not knowing what was going on. I found his teachings confusing and hard to understand. And I just felt more and more like, as I learned about him and his ministry and what was in the Gospels, that I really had no idea who this person was or what he was trying to share. And recently in life, my mind has been turned to this idea, has been attracted to this idea of the kingdom of God as a place we can create here on earth. As I've mentioned in one of my prior sermons when I've been here in months past. But even as I've been encountering these texts over and over again, they're so diverse and different that each one has a bit of a different perspective of what the kingdom of God might look like or be like. They're all like clues or pieces of a puzzle. I'm in a church group where we've been walking through the Gospel of Luke step by step, where many of these passages talking about the kingdom of God are located. And I can tell you, I still have a pretty hard time understanding what he's talking about. And I had a very specific reason for wanting to pick the specific passage that I picked for you, Mainline, as I was coming here to preach today, but I'll get to that a little bit later on. And we're going to talk about a few other of the Kingdom of God passages and why they're relevant to us in the modern world today. But if I was going to take all of the bits and pieces that I've read from the Gospels about what the kingdom of God is, how I would describe it as succinctly and clearly as possible, I would start by saying, the kingdom of heaven is the way things should be. The way when you imagine the world as you would like to see it, I believe that's the kingdom of heaven. Not so much having to do with our particular interests or wants in life, but when you think about the world in peace, the world in harmony, what a heaven might look like, I believe that's the way it was supposed to be. And so when Jesus was talking about this in his context, he had a very specific idea of what he was thinking about. He was preaching as someone who was a lot like a Pharisee, interpreting the texts of the Old Testament to his context, his crowd, and that meant something very particular to Second Temple Judaism. But what I'm more interested in talking about today, and I imagine that most of you would be more interested in talking about, is what that means for us. And one of the important components of the idea of the kingdom of God is this sense of already and not yet. So for the rest of the sermon, I'm going to address it in those ideas. Already and not yet. Now, if already I've completely lost you because you're like, oh my gosh, she just read us a scary parable and she's using the God word. If that does not appeal to you, particularly say you don't have a theology that involves God, that's okay. I hope that there is something here that you can find valuable, that speaks to what is most important in your life, that resonates with your humanist heart or mind. So let's think about the already. Let's talk about the here and now. So I personally identify as a Christian. You are Unitarian Universalists. And I want to incorporate here something that practices that many of you also probably use in your spiritual life. I want to talk a little bit about the techniques of meditation and yoga. I was so happy with this partnership because Noel led us in such a wonderful meditation that just segued so perfectly into this. But before I get to meditation and yoga, I got to start with Unitarian Universalism. Because I think one of the reasons the kingdom of God captured my imagination is because of what I learned from Unitarian Universalists. See, your tradition upholds the spark within, the spark of the divine, that special deep place in us that makes us human, makes us unique in this universe. I see that spark whenever you light the chalice, whatever you think that is. I believe that it's given, and that's what gives us our human dignity. And so whenever I think of that spark, the spark of the divine that each one of us has that makes us unique and special individuals, I liken that to the teachings that I learned through yoga. So I can't say that yoga directly led into my understanding of the kingdom of God, but for those of you who practice hatha yoga, you know that it has a lot to do with your body. You do a lot of stretching and breath work. And those are such useful tools because as you move your body, you become more comfortable in your body. You become comfortable in this vessel that we have to walk around this earth with. And you get a stronger sense of self in who you are because of the limits of your physicalness in the way that you move throughout the world. And things like moving your body and taking deep breaths, they help you to understand what is you and what is not you. And there's a lot that is also separate from you. And for me, I find particularly I need to separate myself from thoughts, from the hamster wheel that goes in my head on a day-to-day basis. Do any of you have that? Anybody here? A few? Okay. So when we breathe, when we recognize ourselves, and we pay attention to what's going on inside of us, we can kind of get rid of some of the noise, some of the traffic in our minds. And that's what a practice really helps with. So yoga, we move our bodies, we exercise so that we can get comfortable sitting in and meditating. So Nuala mentioned in my introduction that I recently went to my first silent retreat. Silence is just not everybody's cup of tea. I personally enjoy it. We had some silence here this morning, but I'm not going to espouse the wonders of a silent retreat because I know for some of you that would just make you very sad. But I do want to talk about what I learned at my meditation retreat. My teacher who is one of the people in my life that has influenced me greatly, that has gotten me to the point where I can stand up here and talk to all of you, encouraged us as we meditated to sink into the silence, to sink into the stillness, so to kind of let go of some of the busyness of our modern lives. And instead of being up here in my head, which I know you are really good at, being up here in your heads, where all of these thoughts are just going and floating, she encouraged us to sink below that. She described it I'm a big fan of metaphors, if you can't tell, but she described it as a lake. So getting out of the currents on the top of the lakes and sinking down to the placidness at the bottom of the lake. And that's where you try to sit when you meditate, is in that quiet space. And after you practice and you do what you do to get to that bottom of the lake. And for you, maybe it's not meditation. I can't, these are the ways that I find myself in that still place where I hear the still small voice that comes from me, that comes from God. But you might have a completely different way of doing it. Perhaps for you, it's when you're working in your wood shop, or you're, hanging out looking at some beautiful mountains. Maybe it's whenever you're enjoying time with your partner. Whatever it is for you that gives you that stillness, that peace in your soul, when you're there, you can recognize yourself, the you, but also the way that you are connected to everything else in the bigger sense of the picture. You get down to that spark of the divine that you realize is the same stuff that the stars are made of. That place in you that is special, that gives you your inherent worth and dignity. If you believe in God, maybe that's the seed in you that God put there when you were born. But you find that self with a capital S that connects you to all of those things and more. And so, this is where I come back to the Gospels. So, as I walked through the deep wonderfulness that I learned from the Unitarian Universalist context, and through yoga, and through the practice of meditation, I came back to the Gospels. And one of the ways that Jesus describes the kingdom of heaven is as a mustard seed. Do you know how small a mustard seed is? It could fit on the tip of my finger. I appreciated how tiny the pearls were that Dawn Star had. She didn't pull out a big rock of a pearl to show it off so it was shiny so that everyone could see in the back, but they were tiny and beautiful pearls. And in this same way, Jesus talks about the kingdom of heaven as a mustard seed, this tiny, tiny thing that you plant in the ground, but that makes a massive bush, and then an even bigger tree. So the idea that that which is planted grows into something big and beautiful that produces oxygen and shade. So if we think of the kingdom of heaven as something not that is outside of us, something not that is in some distant future that we only get to experience when we die, but maybe it's a seed that's planted inside of us that blooms as we grow as individuals, as we grow in community, as we grow as people of love who strive for good things for this world. So we can see it as a spark, as a self, as a mustard seed, as a pearl so precious that you would give everything away to have it. Can you imagine? Another text that I thought about selecting for this service was in Matthew 6 that talked about just not worrying about what you wear or what you're going to eat, just letting go of those fundamental concerns that run your mind so that you can focus on that peace, on that seed, on that placid place inside of you. Now, of course, for some people, they have to be concerned about those things because they don't know where the next meal is coming from. But for those, there are many of us that live in comfort that don't need to worry about those things on a day-to-day basis. And it may be important that we look toward the people that need help, but in our own lives, it's important that we see that we can let go of worry and that we can find that deeper place within to focus and settle in. So I've talked a lot about human dignity, and I suppose that's because it's a really important part of the kingdom of heaven that I imagine. And it fits so well with the first principle of Unitarian Universalism. Because when you truly believe in the inherent worth and dignity of every person, you have no choice but to treat them in a way that facilitates the kingdom of heaven. Like, think about it. If every person on this planet was treated according to their individual worth and dignity, what would our world look like? So I kind of cheated, and before I preached this sermon, I decided to use a bunch of teenagers as guinea pigs for this conversation. I was teaching a class of youth students at a church in southern Lancaster County. It was more rural and definitely more right of center than this church. So they were a little bit on the conservative side. And I gave the students all of these passages about the kingdom of God and facilitated conversation. I was curious what they had to say because, you know, kids really do say the darndest things. And I was surprised by this more conservative Christian church because of the two comments, well, maybe 2.5 comments that really stuck with me. Whenever I asked the children if they believed that we could create the kingdom of heaven on earth, they really didn't seem to think so. They were kind of feeling pessimistic about that. And some of that might be because theologically their church would always lean toward believing that the kingdom of heaven is mostly just the place you go when you die. But also because they look around at the world that they see today, and they're just not sure that we can achieve these things. The two things that were specifically mentioned was one person said that they were concerned because of the administration that was running our federal body in this country, which shocked me. And then the other thing they said was that we couldn't create the kingdom of heaven on earth because of global warming, or climate change, if I'm being more politically correct. And that really astounded me, that these young people just didn't really feel like we had time to do this. And I take comfort in the idea of already and not yet. Because if you think about it from the stance of already, we still have time. And if we think about it from the stance of not yet, that also gives us a little bit of room to breathe. When I think about what the kingdom of heaven would look like, I was struck the other day. I was flying home, myself from Oregon. My partner and I are in a long-distance relationship on opposite sides of the country. And as I was sitting in the airport moping because I had to leave my partner behind for another 6 weeks or so, I was struck because the thought that went through my head is that the kingdom of heaven is a place where people who love each other are not separated. And that one thought immediately took me to the border, to a place where parents who love their children are being separated, where spouses are being separated, potentially never to see each other again, where people who are leaving chaotic environments to seek a refuge might never see the people that are dearest to them again. And my heart ached for them. So when I see the kingdom of heaven, I see a place where people who love each other are not separated. A place where we work together to heal our planet. And I have to say, this is the part where I explain why I picked that particular parable for all of you, because it reminded me of you. And not in any bad way, that I hope you take this the right way, the way that I intend. But when I thought of those two sons, the first one being asked by his father to go work in the vineyard, and he was like, no way, and then he ended up going, that reminded me a little bit of UUs. I feel like so independently minded, you tell them to do something, they're going to think about it twice. But you do it, and that's the important thing, because in the end, who obeyed the father but the son who went and did it, even though he said no originally? The second one said, oh, sure, I'll do it, and then didn't actually follow through. And I see UUs as the first. I have to say the second part that talks about the vineyard and the tenants in the vineyard, that's a very violent story, and I don't particularly love reading violent stories in church. But I did think about it in the end when it said, it's talking about fruitful people, and that the kingdom will be given to those who are going to be fruitful with it. And in my mind, I do want to pat Unitarian Universalists on the back, because I feel like this is a church, this is a religion that is working to create the kingdom of heaven. I think it is a fruitful tradition that is working to manifest the kingdom of heaven on earth today. And I appreciate that, and I want to say that. I think there's also something to be looked at in that parable about prophets. And prophetic voices is something that Unitarian Universalists cherish and recognize from multiple religious traditions. And I think it's important to recognize when we think about global warming in our administration, we have to continue to consider the prophets that get sent away from the vineyard. And we have to continue, as liberally religious people, to hear what they have to say when it comes to the crisis at the border, when it comes to war in foreign countries, when it comes to feeding the poor and the hungry. We have to listen to the prophets. And so I want to offer you that very kind pat in the back and let you know my pride in you. But I also want to challenge you, because no sermon is really worth its salt unless there's a little bit of a challenge. So what are you specifically doing to bring about the kingdom of heaven here and now? Sure, we can think about what we want it to look like in the days to come, but each one of us only has a short period of time on this earth. So if we could work today to make the kingdom of heaven here among us, in this church, in Devon, in Philadelphia, in the state of Pennsylvania, in the United States of America, what would it look like? And what are you doing to contribute? I like to think that one day I will operate with a kingdom mind, and that I will see everybody for the divine spark, the mustard seed, the pearl of great price that lives in them. But it's a lot of work. And so I want to challenge you, MLUC, to do that work with me together. And let's make the kingdom. Blessed be.